Welcome to the podcast. In our last episode, we heard the tale of New Albion, a colony that existed almost completely within the imagination of one Sir Edmund Plowden, or Ployden, where he envisioned a grand and feudal English colony in the 1630s and 40s. There was, in fact, already colonies there, known as New Netherland and New Sweden, both of which were covered in the first season of this podcast. And if you listened closely, you know that his fantasy came true, but just not for him. Because New Netherland was taken over in 1664 by the English and given to the Duke of York, the little brother of King Charles II, and became a place you might have heard of called New York. The town of Beverwyck became Albany, New York. The city of New Amsterdam became New York City. And importantly to future episodes of this podcast, the bottom chunk of what was New Netherland was given away to two prominent supporters of the royal family, who supported them through the tough times, the Civil War, and the Commonwealth period. And as reward, they would be granted a large chunk of land. The English sources from the time call this area Albion, or Albania, believe it or not. Just another legacy of our subject in our last episode. Vaguely, this area is renamed New Jersey. And why that name? Well, that's because the land was being given to Lord Berkeley and Lord Carteret. And Lord Carteret had been the governor of the Isle of Jersey. And Lord Berkeley himself gained a bit of acclaim for his defense of the Isle of Jersey some decades before. The gifting of this land, of course, would be shocking news to the new English governor of New York, one Governor Nichols, who had spent his time confirming land purchases by various English groups moving into the area that would now become the colony of New Jersey. And so it came as quite a shock in August of 1665 when a man named Philip Carteret arrived in New York City. A cousin of Lord Carteret, of course. The Lords Berkeley and Carteret had appointed Philip Carteret to become the new governor of New Jersey. Now, Governor Nichols immediately took issue with this. The Duke of York, of course, could sell or give away any of the land within his own proprietary colony, just like you could dispense with any property that you have, real estate or other. But Governor Nichols argued that the Duke of York, in fact, did not have the right to give someone else the ability to form an English government. The power of governance came from the king himself, not the king's brother. And thus begins the long struggle between New York and New Jersey, wherein New York is constantly trying to delegitimize the government of New Jersey and future East New Jersey and future West New Jersey. In any form of New Jersey for that matter, it's going to be very difficult to maintain any sort of governance when you have your own English neighbors denying your legal existence. Not to mention, just to set the scene, just because New Netherland was taken over and New Sweden was taken over doesn't mean the people went home. Very few people did, because their rights and privileges were mostly maintained by the invading English authorities. But that meant that both New York and New Jersey had large populations that were not English. And in fact, many English people who had moved there before the English takeover, they weren't terribly loyal to English authorities. So even your English are not politically terribly English. And the rest of the European population is Dutch, Swedish, Finnish, French Huguenots, and a smattering of other continental European groups. Now, many of the native groups really didn't have too much exposure or loyalty, for that matter, to the English. If we go to upstate New York, for instance, the Iroquois, or the Haudenosaunee, conducted most of their communication through a cabal, or a syndicate of Dutch traders whose families had long since nurtured relationships with the Mohawk Nation. Down in lower New York on Long Island, especially on the eastern portion of Long Island, the settlements there had long been mostly independent, and there was a short bid by a man named John Scott to make Long Island into its own colony. But New York's woes would pale in comparison to those of the proprietary government of New Jersey. Now, a proprietary government, as I've explained in other podcasts, so please bear with me, is when the proprietor, so the owner of the land, the landlord, is also vested with the power to govern, which the Lords Berkeley and Carteret would insist that they have, despite what the governor of New York says. These two lords published a document called the Concessions and Agreements, which was a constitution of sorts and a vague Bill of Rights applying to the settlers who would decide to live within their New Jersey colony. The document is very similar to a Concessions and Agreements document that the Carolina colony developed, of which Berkeley and Carteret were also proprietors. In the New Jersey document, there were some very liberal terms. Each family would receive 150 acres, an additional 150 acres for each male indentured servant, 75 more acres for each female indentured servant or enslaved person. And those extra 75 for the indentured servants would, of course, be given to the servant at the end of their term. Until then, it was the property of their master. But I could go into detail about every little provision in the concessions. However, this is not a podcast about New Jersey, is it? That would not fall within the purview of the other states of America history podcast. And so what's important to this story is that settlers would be given a 5-year grace period before they would have to start paying a quit rent, which, as I've said many times before, a quit rent, a modern equivalent would be property tax. You have 5 years of tax-free living ahead of you, which meant that in the short term, Governor Carteret wouldn't have to worry about too much internal strife because he's not really asking too much of the civilian population filling in his cousin's colony. And so the various Quakers, Dutch, Swedes, New Englanders, and Finns, they tolerated Governor Carteret at least for a little while, even though New York and its governor questioned the very existence of a colony of New Jersey. Governor Nichols would be spending the year 1667 writing back home in order to get a little clarification on the status of New Jersey. Does it exist at all? Is it just part of New York? How is it possible that the Duke of York can bestow governing powers beyond those already delegated from his brother? And the New York governor's hardline stance against the legitimacy of New Jersey had its effect on those settlers who had their land purchases confirmed by New York before the New Jersey governor rolled in. This would include the settlers of the Monmouth Patent, which at the time comprised of the cities of Shrewsbury and Middletown. In 1667, those two locales created their own assembly, and they refused to recognize the authority of the proprietors and their appointed governor. Rolling into the year 1668, other parts of New Jersey, especially in eastern New Jersey, reject the authority of Governor Carteret. Surprisingly, it was the English towns that were springing up in East Jersey that were the most vocal in their disdain for Governor Carteret and the proprietors. And as we move closer to that date where the quit rents would start to become due, the dissent only gets worse. The governor of New York just lapping all of this up, thinking that he's making his own colony stronger, the Duke's colony stronger, following a series of scandals back in merry old England. In 1669, both Lord Berkeley and Carteret lose much of their political clout. The Wolves, of course, pounce and try to have their patent to New Jersey rescinded, which brings us very quickly into the year 1670, when Governor Philip Carteret is supposed to collect the first of these quit rents. Not only did many of the settlers refuse to pay them, the settlers who had their land confirmed by the governor of New York, Governor Nichols, they didn't even register their land claims with the New Jersey government. They're not on the rolls. And in November of 1671, the New Jersey General Assembly, that is the assembly that was recognized by Governor Carteret, finally found the towns of Shrewsbury and Middletown in contempt against lawful authority for the inability of the governor to collect taxes there. You think bringing down the hammer of justice in the cold November of 1671 would have done the trick. It did not. Moving into 1672, these two towns being in contempt and yet really facing no consequence only encouraged towns throughout New Jersey, to have unauthorized assemblies and this emerging rival government, in order to possibly gain some air of legitimacy, elected a man by the name of James Carteret to be their governor of New Jersey. Now, James Carteret was the illegitimate son of Lord Carteret. Yes, you heard me right. They're going to use an illegitimate son to give themselves legitimacy. James sets himself up as governor in defiance of his cousin. Now, at this point, we could have a real head-to-head. Governor Carteret against Governor Carteret. But Philip Carteret, not looking for a fight, decides to get on a boat and he leaves for England in order to secure the paperwork necessary to show everyone, people of New Jersey, the governor of New York, that he in fact is the legitimate governor of New Jersey. And maybe doing a little tattletaling to the Lord Carteret about what his oopsie child is up to in the New World. And honestly, it seems like he just doesn't want to go back, because throughout the entire year of 1673, doesn't make an appearance, but preceding him were the requested documents explaining the situation, outlining who the governor is, and demanding that the new governor of New York, no longer Nichols, Governor Lovelace, aid his neighbor, Governor Philip Carteret, any way he can. But Governor Lovelace of New York was not terribly worried about ensuring the Lord Berkeley and Carteret's holdings in the New World, and he really didn't want to expend the resources to prop up a different colonial government, because in the preceding June, Governor Lovelace received information that a war had broken out between England and the Netherlands. This would be June of 1672, and here he was, the governor of a former Dutch possession, and even under an English flag, still contained thousands of Dutch residents. And with that, I've set the scene. If you've been listening intently, you have all the little chess pieces in place for what's going on in the English Middle Colonies. Now, we have to travel over across the Atlantic to the Netherlands, because if I've already set the scene, we need to actually meet the actors. And the actors in this story, by and large, will not be English governors. They are background people. They're moving set pieces around. But the real stars of this episode, from the onset, had no intention of creating a new Netherland. With the outbreak of hostilities between England and the Netherlands, ships of the Dutch Republic could now hunt down English ships, and vice versa. The political organization of the Netherlands, as it was then, is not what it is today. Now we think of it as a unified state, but in the 1670s, it was, and had been for some time, a confederation of provinces, as we saw in season 1 of this podcast, which meant that sometimes the individual pieces of this larger collective sometimes competed with one another, or enjoyed a great deal of autonomy, even if there were some overarching authority figure above all, usually by design ineffective, very limited. Now, this also applied to the Navy of the Netherlands, which consisted of 5 admiralties, who could work jointly, but were just as likely to conduct independent operations. Our story is taking us to the Admiralty of Zeeland. Zeeland is a province of the Netherlands, and historically is the only province that could truly rival Holland as a naval power. And with the outbreak of the Third Anglo-Dutch War, it was the Admiralty of Zeeland that sought to enrich itself off of taking English ships and their cargo. Cornelis Evertsen, the younger, from a very famous naval family, was made admiral and tasked with this important mission. He was given 6 ships and 586 men. These men would be a mixture of sailors and marines, with a smattering of those who had other specialties. Specifically and originally, they were tasked with taking ships that belonged to the English East India Company, an up-and-coming rival to the Dutch East India Company, the Amazon.com of its day. Under Evertsen would be a man by the name of Anthony Colve, who would be in charge of the Marines. Also from a prominent family, Colve likely came from a branch of what used to be a noble family, but no longer held title, but still had some means, still had some money. In 1672, when they set out, he's about 28 years old. Without getting too much into the Dutch politics of the time, Colv's family were by and large Orangists, which meant they supported the Prince of Orange, the Stadtholder. Having recently been restored during this year, the Stadtholder was a sort of head of state, whereas other European countries were monarchies and had a king or queen. The confederacy that was the Netherlands would have this Stadtholder from this point until well into the 18th century, wherein this figure was not as powerful as a king and could never take on the name of a king or a queen. They couldn't take on that title, rather. In fact, if you look at the etymology of the word Stadtholder, you'll see it means like placeholder. So this is a person that in other times and places might be called a steward. The Prince of Orange would have some of the powers you would associate with a king, and yet many of those powers would be by de facto rather than de jure, and while being honored with the title of prince, he would never become a king over the Netherlands, at least until after the time of Napoleon. Well, anyway, the Prince of Orange, coming of age by 1672 and fighting political opposition with the help of his Orangists, became the Stadtholder. And so Colv was not just a military man, he was also politically connected. All the better for the Zeelanders to include him in their plans for the Third Anglo-Dutch War. The small fleet left in November of 1672, hunting for those English ships. And it appears they bit off a little more than they could chew. In February of 1673, they were just off the shore of Cape Verde, which is an island off the coast of Africa in the Atlantic Ocean. And they came upon an English fleet, a fleet much larger than theirs. And the mission of the English fleet was to hunt down ships belonging to the Dutch East India Company. And the English had the clear numerical superiority. And so Evertsen did something smart. After nearly being trapped by the English fleet, he threw over much of the fleet's cargo and made a speedy getaway. However, now in the open Atlantic Ocean, it became clear that their primary objective, at least in the form of taking ships from the English East India Company, and don't send me angry messages, yes, later it will become the British East India Company, but not here in 1673, this was a target they weren't going to hit. The Dutch fleet was just too small, they had just lost a lot of their supplies, and the English ships heading for the Eastern Hemisphere seemed to be well prepared for any Dutch attack. But Evertsen knew this couldn't be the end of his expedition. If he returned home and only reported one quick escape, well, couldn't others just color this interaction as a retreat, as a loss? Especially since he'll be returning home with less than he left with. No. Evertsen wouldn't have it. He decided it was now time to go to the Caribbean, and perhaps there he could find easier targets. Well, Evertsen did find easier targets. He also found another Dutch fleet. This one coming from the Admiralty of Holland. Remember, although technically all part of the same navy, they operated fairly independent of one another. This was a small fleet of 6 ships, commanded by Jacob Banks. They were tasked with capturing English and French ships in the Caribbean. Both fleets separately were small to medium in size. With Evertsen having the Marines, both fleets put together could actually be quite formidable. And so both Evertsen and Banks decided to join forces. Again, we see a mixture of official orders, being part of a branch of the military, mixed with a little bit of the entrepreneurial spirit, with a little dose of free will. Together, they cleaned up a large swath of the Caribbean, both at sea and at shore, where they eventually received information that north in Virginia, the tobacco planters would soon be exporting their crop, and there would be a large number of small merchant operations to bring that cargo elsewhere. And so Evertsen and Banks, far stronger collectively, and only greater still after taking ships in the Caribbean, went north to Virginia, where they caught a great number of English ships by surprise, and gained a fortune in tobacco. But, more importantly to our story, on one ship was James Carteret, his wife, and his friend Samuel Hopkins. You see, it was during this year, 1673, that Governor Carteret received confirmation of his authority in the New World. Although the governor had not yet returned from England, his paperwork did. And the illegal government headed by James Carteret fell apart quickly, and he was no longer welcome in New York or New Jersey, being seen as a liability. And now the Dutch fleet had picked him up in a ship off the coast of Virginia. Now, we don't exactly know what James Carteret told the Dutch. However, we do know that instead of being taken hostage, which a member of the Carteret family could return a nice profit for you, Carteret and his wife were dropped off on the coast of Virginia on July 21st. Meanwhile, his friend, Hopkins, stayed with the Dutch. Not exactly a prisoner. And then the Dutch fleet, who originally had their eye on heading to Newfoundland, decided instead that there might be some opportunities a little closer to Virginia, in the areas that we would call New Jersey and New York. Which begs the question, what did James Carteret tell them? Now we're getting into the area of speculation, but it explains the behavior of the Dutch in this case. It's likely that James Carteret informed the Dutch as to the political condition of the colony of New Jersey and New York. How New Jersey was in shambles, had two competing governments, and its fellow English colony of New York simply didn't believe that New Jersey legally existed. Meanwhile, New York had its own problems, with much of Long Island being settled by New Englanders who really didn't want to be under the yoke of the Duke of York. And sprinkled all throughout were other ethnic groups, including a heavy dose of the Dutch, who simply did not have any strong allegiance to English authority. In the case of New Jersey, of course, that English authority was non-existent. There was no governor in the colony. The Dutch fleet decided, well, it's worth a look. On July 28, 1673, the fleet took sight of New York Bay, and they came to anchor off of Sandy Hook the next day on the 29th. Rather conspicuous, the authors Donald Chimay and Robert Haslock, they say of this event, "The presence of the Dutch fleet on the shores of a former Netherlands colony quickly aroused the long smoldering fires of patriotism and support in the hearts of many former Dutch citizens of New Netherland." That night, several farmers from the town of New Utrecht on Long Island and from Staten Island made their way out to the fleet and boarded the Zeeland flagship, Schwanenberg. These farmers confirmed much of what the Dutch fleet probably learned from James Carteret. They complained about English rule. They claimed that Governor Lovelace wasn't even in the colony and certainly wasn't in Fort James, the fort at the bottom of Manhattan Island. And a plan began to form in the minds of Banks and Everetson that maybe through their combined efforts, they don't just have to raid and pillage. They don't just have to take ships off the coast. While they had already done their share of profiteering, maybe they could do a little state building. If the information they received was accurate, between their ships of war and the Marines under Captain Cole, they could take Fort James, which at the time served as a sort of military and political capital of the colony of New York. Just New York City itself had about 2,500 residents. Most of them were still Dutch. The next day, Everetson and Banks sent a letter to the Dutch of New York City and those other residents who had lived there when it was New Amsterdam. Part of it said the following: "We do not intend to bring harm to anyone who voluntarily submits to the aforementioned high mightiness, under whom before this you live so peacefully." In other words, if you submit to the States General of the Netherlands and the Prince of Orange, life can go on just as it did before under the English, and before that under the Dutch. And in the nicest way possible, this was Everetson and Banks telling the people of New York City, we're coming. They also sent messages to the commander of Fort James, who was a certain Captain Manning, informing him that 600 Marines were prepared to lay siege to the fort if necessary. In the back and forth messages between the English fort and the Dutch fleet, Captain Manning tried his best to stall the Dutch from doing anything. Every deadline that the Dutch would give him, he would respond at the very end of it. In their correspondence, Captain Manning would give non-committal answers, vague responses, or answer questions with questions. Of course, Everetson and Banks, they were on to him, and they surmised that Captain Manning was surely stalling in the hope that reinforcements would arrive from Connecticut, or perhaps New Jersey, or maybe the fort in Albany. The truth of the matter is Fort James had about 100 defenders. Once Everetson and Banks got sick of Captain Manning, their pen pal, forestalling what they saw as the inevitable, they decided to land the Marines under the command of Captain Colve, while at the same time, they started exchanging fire with the fort itself from their warships. After about an hour of this back and forth, the English fort had just about had it. The guns that they had there, the cannons, they were in disrepair, and a few didn't even work at all. One Englishman in the fort actually decided to do a little showboating, parading around the English flag at the top of the fort, promptly had his head shot off. Captain Manning on the shore with his Marines began marching down Broadway. Much to their delight, the people of New York City came out to cheer on the parade of men heading to Fort James. Somehow these raiders and soldiers of opportunity became liberators, at least in the eyes of the Dutch living in New York City. Colve stopped some distance from Fort James, well beyond cannon shot, and waited. Captain Manning in the fort, seeing that he was outgunned at sea and outmanned on land, threw up the white flag for a truce. Captain Colve, seeing the flag, made his final advance upon Fort James. Captain Manning from within the fort drafted terms of surrender and sent them out to Captain Colve. Manning asked that all of his men be allowed to leave unmolested from the fort with their possessions. But Captain Colve, he sensed weakness in the man and sent Captain Manning back his own terms, which stipulated that Manning was to surrender along with his men, they were to be disarmed, and then become prisoners in their own fort. Surprisingly, Captain Manning agreed, and he threw open the gates to Fort James. Evertson, Banks, and Colve seized all of the property within the fort in the name of the Netherlands for losses that they received during the first takeover of New Netherland. The next day, the prisoners were sent onto the Dutch ships, where they could be more easily secured, they could be stopped from escaping, and have no influence on the population around them. A number of the Dutch Marines decided to ransack nearby estates, including the house of Governor Lovelace, still not in the colony, and the mayor of New York City, John Lawrence. Feeling that this would threaten the peaceful takeover of New York City, the Dutch captains did execute at least one of their men for looting. On July 31st, 1673, Evertson and Banks, they renamed New York City New Orange, and Fort James, Fort Willem Henrik, both of course in honor of the Prince of Orange. And with that, New Netherland was reborn. But it was tiny. We're talking about Manhattan Island. And outside of that, at least in theory, there still remained a New York and a New Jersey. Evertson and Banks, along with Colve, of course, had taken the tiger by the tail. And now they had to bring the rest of it to heel, town by town, village by village. The men created what they called a council of war that would serve as a provisional government working out of Fort James. Colve, again the man in charge of the Marines, was selected to be the governor of New Netherland. A wise choice. Again, he seemed to have had some connection to the Prince of Orange, and he was the highest ranking officer outside of Banks and Evertson over the land forces, which will become important if you want to maintain a colony. Not surprisingly, deputies from towns in New Jersey, not all the towns in New Jersey, but many of the towns, especially the Dutch towns, began arriving in New Orange as early as the 2nd of August to submit to the new Dutch government. This included many of the towns that had been trouble to the Carteret government, and places like Newark, which, as we learned at the ending of another episode of ours, was founded by New Englanders from New Haven, or the former New Haven colony. Locally, within the city, the Dutch dissolve officially the English government of New York City, and they call for new elections for new officials who will owe their allegiance to the Dutch. They held elections on August 4th. 5 Dutchmen were elected and 1 Englishman. Many of the Dutchmen were the prominent merchants of New Amsterdam in the closing years of the former New Netherland. And so this new New Netherland wasn't so much a revolution or even seen as a next phase. Rather, it was reverting back to the former status quo. And a very important part of that status quo was maintaining trade and a good relationship with the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois Confederacy. Luckily for the Dutch, a cabal of Dutch traders, even under English rule, controlled the communication lines between the Iroquois and the English authorities at what they call the city of Albany. Now all Governor Colve had to do was send some men upriver, up the Hudson River, and bring Albany back into the New Netherland fold. And along the way, garner the allegiance of any settlement that might be along the Hudson River. This would include the very early settlement of Kingston, whom the Dutch called originally Wildschwik, meaning wild town. It's where my wife is from. I should have known better. A force of 70 men and 2 ships is placed under the command of a man named Lieutenant Becker, and they set out in early August of 1673 to secure what we would now call upstate New York. When he arrives in Albany, the fort at Albany submitted without a struggle, and Lieutenant Becker renamed it Fort Nassau, and the city of Albany became Wilhelmstadt. Again, both names an homage to the Prince of Orange. Without any struggle, he had all the towns along the Hudson submit to Dutch authority. He even had the lonely town of Schenectady on the Mohawk River, mostly full of Dutch anyway, submit to this new authority. These towns quickly held their own elections for their own deputies who would serve as representatives to the governor. Before the end of the month, those deputies found their way down to New Orange to receive the blessing of Governor Colve himself. Now let's head out to Long Island. The Dutch settlements on Long Island very quickly submitted to the new Dutch government at New Orange. No surprise there. But then further east on the island, those English towns, those troublesome English towns, who were settled by New Englanders, who didn't actually want to be part of the New Haven colony or the Connecticut colony, and who had spent the last 10 years balking at the idea of being part of the New York colony, they did not volunteer to join this new colony of New Netherland. Yes, these towns full of Englishmen, they didn't even want to be part of an outside English authority, let alone a new and shaky Dutch government established by sailors. Nevertheless, a few towns submitted to the new Dutch authority, although most of them simply did not respond, which really was the wisest course to take in this particular situation if you were English. If this new Netherland proved to be short-lived and English authority was reestablished, you could not be punished for being a turncoat. At the same time, by not responding, if the Dutch decided to show up in force, well, you haven't outright rejected their authority. So, if push came to shove, you could submit at that later time, if it ever even came. It seems like some English towns were playing the waiting game. As their recent history had demonstrated, this is the Third Anglo-Dutch War, and so patterns begin to develop, and they know that Anglo-Dutch wars tend to not last very long, and probably within a year or so, they wouldn't have to submit to some guy in a fort on Manhattan Island. The respective mother countries of the Netherlands and of England would make a peace treaty. There might be some trades back and forth, and they will let you know under whose empire you belong. So maybe just wait it out so you don't end up giving your allegiance over to the loser. Eastern Long Island would prove to be a challenge, and that story will continue as we move forward. But, again, the parts of old New Netherland, as it was in 1664, very conveniently fell into place. We have most of what you would now call New York State, except again for that little part of Long Island. All the settlements around Manhattan Island very quickly sent their deputies to Fort William Henry, and then the settlements in what would now be New Jersey and even Delaware, as they had become accustomed to doing, completely ignored the Carteret government that was there, and the acting governor, Governor Barry, held new elections and once again became part of New Netherland. Many of the new leaders of the former New Jersey colony, now southern New Netherland, were the same rebel rousers from the last decade who made it nearly impossible for the English to have sensible government in the colony. Now they were the government. Powerless to any of this, acting Governor John Barry and his deputies, they went to New Orange, and they sought an audience with Governor Colve and Admirals Evertson and Banks, who initially refused an audience. There's no reason to give this guy any amount of their time. They don't even acknowledge his authority. And when they finally do allow him to have an audience, it was for the purposes of confirming their individual estates under the new Netherland. And with that, New Jersey is subdued. And why was it so easy? Well, the terms for switching your allegiance to the Netherlands, to the Dutch, to the Prince of Orange, were very, very liberal, wherein those who submitted peacefully would get to keep their personal property and their estates and go about their business unmolested, whether they be Dutch or English, German, Swede, or Finn. And for the Englishmen specifically, they were promised that they would not be drafted to fight other Englishmen or an English army. A very appealing offer, especially if you want to continue going about your life as you did before. Also, as became a custom in the middle colonies anyway, they had a guarantee of freedom of religion, something that the old New Netherland colony had eventually, and something that we will see in our future episodes on East and West New Jersey. Spoiler alert! Lastly, if you didn't want to submit to the new Dutch authority, you had 6 months to get your affairs in order and leave the colony. Honestly, even that is a fair offer to extend to somebody who has no intention of cooperating with you. And in just a few short minutes, we've gone from the Mohawk River all the way down to the Delaware River. And for Evertson, Banks, and Colve, in what only took about a month of their time, they had reestablished New Netherland. But of course, if you remember the first season of this podcast, the population of New England, or the English Southern colonies, collectively or even in individual groups, far larger than what you will see in the middle colonies. And so inevitably, these larger English colonies who are neighboring New Netherland, they're going to come knocking, maybe peacefully or maybe with sword in hand. Well, we see on August 13th, 2 representatives appear in New Orange from the Connecticut colony. Now, these men request an audience with the Council of War. And to the surprise of the Dutch, the men have an extremely reasonable proposal, wherein Connecticut and New Netherland would renew the peace that they had formerly when New Netherland was run by Peter Stuyvesant, promising specifically that Connecticut would make no first move to war if New Netherland did not do the same. Remember, although their mother countries are at war with one another, colonies like Connecticut are under no obligation to mobilize and risk lives to reinvade New Netherland. They're expected not to carry on trade with New Netherland, certainly don't be friendly with them, but if Connecticut were to war with New Netherland, that would have to be an internal decision of the Connecticut government itself, or the confederacy that it belonged to, the United Colonies of New England. All in all, these Connecticut messengers had a pretty good deal to offer. However, Evertson and Banks, they requested that these terms be put into writing. And then the 2 diplomats said that they simply did not have the authority to create such a document for their colony. And so with some hemming and hawing, the 2 diplomats were forced to go away without any sort of resolution. Had the Dutch been a little less heavy-handed and just accepted the verbal agreement, maybe they could have slept a little better at night. I don't know. But after this interaction, the New England question is thrown up into the air. Are they coming? Are they mobilizing? Do they like us? Won't you be my neighbor? Is it a beautiful day in the neighborhood? We don't know. And we'll see throughout our story, just as when Colve would not accept the original terms of surrender, these Dutch military men who are now trying to become administrators of a government tend to be heavy-handed when dealing with adversaries. And sometimes it doesn't really work to their best interest. Which brings us right into our next subject, because what was their interests? Evertson and Banks, anyway. Remember, they were never supposed to become statesmen and leaders and defenders of a colony placed smack dab in the middle of English North America. In fact, their superiors back home don't even know about this yet. While Evertson and Banks could spare Governor Colve a couple ships and a large number of the ground forces, it became clear that, as amazing as reestablishing New Netherland is, neither Evertson nor Banks had orders to do this. Their individual missions remained unfulfilled. And so it became clear to them that they had to leave New Netherland and head for the original agreed upon target that they had in mind in the Caribbean, the fisheries around Newfoundland. As you can imagine, when news got out that Evertson and Banks would be departing soon and taking a fair number of the men and most of the ships with them, all of these newly minted local officials who had just handed over their villages to the Dutch became very concerned about the defense of the colony. Evertsen and Banks responded by reassuring the people. They provided for a small garrison that would stay at Fort Willem Hendrik, and they already put in plans to improve the fortifications throughout the entire colony. Indeed, it appears at least the Dutch population were very sad to see these two admirals leave. The historians Donald Chemay and Robert Haslack, they say of the two men, "As the days and weeks that followed would attest, Cornelis Evertsen and Jacob Banks were increasingly viewed by the majority of the Dutch inhabitants of New York and even New Jersey and Delaware as liberating heroes." Surely, much of the population must have been at least a little scared and a little sad to see the men go. One more quote from Donald and Robert. "Evertsen and Banks oversaw an almost flawless and orderly transition from its former administration to civil government in a traditional Dutch form, and without a drop of blood being shed." There you go, 2 quotes from a set of real authors, not an old chunk of coal like me. And so we'll have to say goodbye to Evertsen and Banks, and moving into September of 1673, now it's just Governor Colve. You might be saying to yourself, what about Governor Lovelace, the New York governor? What happened to him? Well, eventually he does make it back to the colony he calls New York, only to quickly become prisoner of the Dutch. And when Banks and Evertsen leave, they take Governor Lovelace with them. Also leaving around this time were a couple of little ships that carried letters from Banks and Evertsen, and from the prominent Dutchmen of former New Jersey and New York, letters that hopefully would make their way to the Netherlands. In these letters, it would explain that yes, New York and New Jersey have been retaken. There is a new Netherland, and also here are all the business opportunities in the reestablished colony. In other words, this is why you should really fight to keep us. Remember, the old New Netherland was owned by the Dutch West India Company. This new Netherland, however, is not. The Netherlands don't even know that they have repossessed the territory, and Evertsen and Banks knew that moving forward, somebody would have to take stewardship of this colony, whether it be the Zeelanders that sent out Evertsen or the Hollanders that sent out Banks. And honestly, this is going to be a hard sell, because it is well known that the Dutch West India Company didn't really make a lot of money off the New Netherland colony. Some years were more profitable, sometimes entire decades, but overall, with the swelling English population on the borders of New Netherland, you can see the Dutch bankers calculating the defense costs year to year. This was going to be a hard sell. Perhaps the most profitable enterprise of New York, New Jersey, and collectively New Netherland would be the fur trade. Diminishing in quantity throughout the decades, not quite as plentiful as it was in the 1640s, 1630s. Still a relatively large market for the New World. And no, the Dutchmen weren't going out and getting their own beaver furs. They were getting them from the Native Americans. And so the Council of War and Governor Colve were greatly relieved when, in September of 1673, the Mohawk Native Americans came to New Orange in order to renew their covenant chain with the Dutch. The nearby Hackensack natives did the same. This meant that the furs would continue flowing without interruption. Seemingly good news all around. But that troublesome Connecticut colony that wouldn't put anything down in writing, rumors made their way back to Fort Willem Hendrik that a Connecticut agent was in eastern Long Island seeking to raise the local militias against the Dutch. Rather than go right for the geographic source of the rumor, Governor Colve decided to reinforce Fort Willem Hendrik and whip the men into shape. He's a smart guy, and he knows New York and New Jersey fell apart just by taking this one fort. It could just as easily be the undoing of New Netherland. For the men of the fort, he made a strict set of laws that all of them were to follow, and a very scheduled regiment throughout the day. And neglect of duty would be punishable by death. Hurting another soldier to the point where that other soldier drew blood, you lose your hand. After this point, he runs the fort more like a ship, something he probably would be more accustomed to. And then really all of New Netherland, rather than taking on the character of Old New Netherland, gained a real military feel. Governor Colve wasn't going to be taken by surprise, and from the Hudson down to the Delaware, the people were instructed to always be on the ready for a potential invasion. Governor Colve saw that Delaware region as being so far away from his grasp that the area was vulnerable to invasion from the southern English colonies. He appoints a man by the name of Peter Ulrichs, a man who worked under Peter Stuyvesant in the former New Netherland, to the post of military commander over the Delaware. And within that, the Delaware would be split into 4 districts, and every 6th man within that district would be enlisted or drafted to help fix the fortifications along the river and build new fortifications. These individuals would be compensated through tax breaks, and Peter Ulrichs was given 10 to 12 soldiers to man at least 1 fort, and all in all, that bottom area of New Netherland would function as a colony within a colony, having far more organization and that middle level, whereas elsewhere, the local deputies would just report to the governor himself. And just like the buildup on the Delaware, New Orange itself would need some fixing up if it were to withstand an attack by the English. One drastic measure that Governor Colve took is that he demolished about 24 houses around Fort Willem Henrik, because these houses could be used to provide coverage for an invading army. Now, we can certainly take his word for this, because he was the commander of the last invading army. Today, we would call the process eminent domain, but 24 or so people lost their homes, and they would be compensated, the governor planned to compensate them anyway, through export duties from furs, alcohol, and guns. And yes, New Orange itself had some reason to be cautious of their English neighbors. The Dutch, as it happens, had been seizing English ships off the coast. And when the Massachusetts government wrote to Governor Colve and told him to stop doing that, or else Massachusetts would commit itself to the recovery of the New York colony, Governor Colve ignored them. If you take in Governor Colve, the man, it seems that he genuinely was not intimidated by these colonials. They weren't professional soldiers. A lot of them had experience in colonial wars as leaders of militias, but it appears he thumbed his nose at them. In all things military, where he was a professional, these people were part-timers. Knowing that there were agitators throughout Long Island, especially in the English eastern section, Colve sent some agents out there in order to administer an oath of allegiance face-to-face, and told his agents to write down the names of anyone who doesn't agree to take the oath. The agents don't find very much success. And just to illustrate this, one specific episode from Long Island occurred in late October of 1673. Governor Winthrop writes Colve condemning his threats to the English on Long Island. Colve responds, resolute and without apology, par for the course for Governor Colve, and blamed any troubles on the Connecticut agitators. He sends 3 agents by boat to Southold. On the way, they come across an English ship carrying 2 agents from the Connecticut colony. One of the agents is none other than John Winthrop Jr.'s own son, Fitzjohn Winthrop. The English ship is doing the opposite of what the Dutch ship is doing. Both are traveling to Long Island. Only the English ship, of course, is trying to secure the allegiance of the Eastern Long Islanders for the English. The explanations are scant. However, it appears that neither ship would really be able to capture the other, and they both eventually make it to Southold. The English make it there first, and when the Dutch get off the ships, they're greeted by the cavalry militia. Whereupon, reaching the shore, the Dutch are escorted to a private individual's house, wherein contained all of the prominent people of the town. The English agents, who had beaten them there and probably done some planning, stepped forward and asked the people of the town, who here renounces their allegiance to England? And of course, none of them stepped forward. Now, the Dutch agents asked who here remained loyal to the oaths that they had given to the States General. Again, no one stepped forward. It's funny, silence for both questions actually only confirmed the view of the English and denied the Dutch their authority. The Dutch then turned to one specific man of Southold who had previously sworn allegiance to the States General and asked him why he now no longer upholds his oath. He cited personal threats and ultimately said he wanted nothing to do with New Netherland. The Dutch agents were then escorted back to their ships, and the English agents from Connecticut informed them that they should probably stay out of eastern Long Island, at least stay out of the range of shot of any local militia. The English might not be invading Manhattan Island, but they are certainly drawing a line. Now overseas, across the Atlantic Ocean, all those messages that were intending to find their way back to Zeeland or Holland, they were intercepted either by the English or allies of the English. And by October 3rd, 1673, the clandestine information found in these letters intended for the Netherlands only betrayed their authors and revealed to the people of England that New York was no more and New Jersey was no more. Yes, the English now knew about the New Netherland before the Dutch. And so yes, England had lost some of her colonies, but the perpetrator was not even aware that it happened yet. That gives England quite an advantage, doesn't it? The one saving grace the Netherlands has at this point is that the Dutch sailors who were captured in the process, they lied. And of course they lied. In reality, Governor Colve had 2 warships and about 120 professional soldiers to hold an area of land that would now be parts of the state of Delaware, New Jersey, New York, and even a little bit of Pennsylvania, I believe. But the Dutch captives lied and exaggerated all the numbers. Immediately, English politicians and businessmen began to mull over various ways to retake this large swath of land. As you can imagine, many wealthy businessmen, nobles, and parliamentarians like the Berkeley family, the Carteret family, the Duke of York himself have great interests in recovering these colonies. Whereas the Dutch, who are not even yet aware that they own this property again, severed much of those business ties years ago with the ending of the old New Netherland. So the English have advanced knowledge, and they also have every motive to try to get this nice chunk of land back. Moving into November 1673, Governor Colve, after the pushback on eastern Long Island, he digs his heels in even deeper, trying to find dissidents among the towns that were under his control. One man by the name of Francis Bedo claimed that he had a commission from some English government to burn down the town of Fordham. Rather than treat him like a nut or a loon, he branded and then banished Francis Bedo from the colony of New Netherland. At the same time, Colve forbids all communication with New England, which meant that ships were searched for correspondence, and any such correspondences found would be confiscated for its information. While this is happening, the Dutch-controlled towns on Long Island report to Governor Colve their fear of an imminent English invasion. Colve has each of their local militias activated and placed on rotation at Fort Willem Henrik, giving an open invitation to all of the Dutch-controlled towns that their citizens are welcomed within the walls of Fort Willem Henrik in the case of an English invasion. But as it turns out, toward the end of 1673, it wasn't Long Island that should be truly fearful of the English, nor Manhattan Island, but far to the south on the Delaware, in the same area as the former colony of Schwanendale, which we learned about in Season 1 of this podcast, there was a small settlement that became known as Hornkill. That settlement was populated by colonists originally sent from Maryland, but being on the other side of the Delaware River, it fell within the Duke of York's grant. Now that there was no New York, Governor Calvert of Maryland was eager to not only get credit for facing off against the Dutch, but also restake his claim across the river, where after all, his own settlers were. The Maryland governor commissions a man by the name of Thomas Howell and 40 men to go and retake Hornkill, whose settlers, like many of the settlements on the Delaware and parts north, had pledged their allegiance to the new Dutch authority. Howell and his men would be sent to liberate them, to protect them. But when he arrived in December of 1673, he only found the settlers. There were no Dutch troops, seemingly no officials appointed by Governor Colve, no military threat at all. And yet, Thomas Howell and his militia decided to stay and whorekill. And what that meant was, in return for his so-called protection, these men would be eating the small village out of their house and homes. Yes, it's reported that they killed livestock and even went as so far as to start stealing things, such as beaver pelts they obtained from the local natives. And within 2 or 3 weeks, it became apparent, even to Thomas Howell himself, that they were literally using up all of the resources of this small village. He contacted the governor, and the governor advised him to burn the village to the ground, and thus destroy a village that had gone over to the Dutch, and keep that village from being a resource to the Dutch. On Christmas Day 1673, Howell had all the townspeople come to the center of town. He told them to bring their weapons. He claimed this was a muster of the militia. His men promptly confiscated all of the weapons, surrounded the townspeople, and announced the burning of the town. He gave everyone 15 minutes to take what they could carry away from their homes. The villagers helplessly watched their entire settlement burn to the ground. Pregnant women begged the Marylander militia for horses so that they could travel somewhere to seek some sort of shelter. They were given none. Howell and company promptly left, leaving the villagers to sort out some sort of existence for themselves deep in the winter of 1673. The people scattered. It is reported that some were killed by natives, some by the elements, and given a few days, a few survivors managed to trickle into the city of New Orange. The first report of them is from January 4th, 1674. Governor Colve pledges to support the survivors of the whorekill disaster. Then he sent word to the other villages on the Delaware, both warning them of the active English in the area and to set an example. You see, this is what happens when you cooperate with the English. Be on alert and do not submit. Now let's take a look at Governor Colve's situation moving into the new year, 1674. He's demolishing properties outside of the fort. He's supporting families who lost everything at the hands of the English. At the fort, he has his own garrison of professional Marines from the Netherlands, and he's having that supplemented by rotations of militia from Long Island. As you can imagine, the costs are starting to pile up. Yes, there were some negative effects of cutting off all trade with every English colony. The local burgermeisters of New Orange complained about the high taxes. The same men some months before who were cheering on Colve as he marched through the streets with his Marines were now pining for the lower taxes that the English put into place in a time of peace. More than anything, the governor hoped, beyond hope, that reinforcements would arrive before the English could develop a true assessment of just how weak the Dutch position was. Now, the timing here, as far as the records are concerned, might be a bit off, because this seems like a freakishly fast trip across the Atlantic. But supposedly, on the first of the year of 1674, by the way the Dutch reckoned it, Governor Colve sent another ship with the news of the Dutch takeover of New York and New Jersey. The ship was commanded by one Captain Vonch. Aptly named, the ship was called the Hope. If caught, he was to throw all correspondence overboard. And if the captain thought that he couldn't get to the Netherlands directly, he was supposed to go to a neutral or allied country and see that the message was relayed over land. Now the timeline gets even fuzzier, because it's recorded that the Dutch learned of the takeover of New York and New Jersey on January 15th, 1674, which seems quick, perhaps too quick. But in the big scheme of things, the exact day that information was transmitted doesn't really impact the story. It's just things that bother me. Now, the Dutch had a very different reaction than the English. The English were heartbroken. Their colonies had been taken, and they wanted them back. Meanwhile, the Dutch, instead of celebrating, weren't really sure what to do with these colonies. Now unified under a new Netherland. Like I said before, the old New Netherland wasn't exactly a cash cow. And then even more than 10 years ago, it is surrounded by English and infested by the English. It's not anything the Dutch really wanted to hold on to. As you remember, the admirals made this a joint operation. The Zeelanders discussed unloading the colony onto Holland, and Holland wasn't really taking the bait. Around the same time, and the timeline here again gets fuzzy, the States General drafts points of a potential peace plan to send off to the English. One of the points is the return of all lands to their previous pre-war owners. King Charles II accepted this draft, which then quickly became the basis of the peace treaty that followed, the Treaty of Westminster. Yes, it would appear that New Netherland served the old Netherlands simply as a bargaining chip, something taken without any real intention of holding nor ability to then be used to recover that which the English have taken possession of during this Third Anglo-Dutch War. And so it did serve a purpose, but New Netherland would be signed away in February of 1674. Of course, the news of this peace and the restoration of New Jersey and New York would, just like the news of the restoration of New Netherland, take some time to cross the Atlantic. Meanwhile, Governor Colve had declared a state of emergency, the timing of which in early January was probably as a result of the Hornkill refugees trickling in. An English ship captain in the port of Boston, spending the winter, a certain Captain Wyborne, tried to raise a force against New Netherland, and he found himself attacked by a Bostonian mob. The people of Boston were not willing to risk their lives and fortunes for the possessions of the Duke of York. However, the aforementioned Fitzjohn Winthrop of Connecticut raises an army and lands it in eastern Long Island. At Southold, he quickly organizes all of the local militias. They engage with Dutch ships just off the coast and manage to scare them away. With a small victory at hand, the English on Long Island are encouraged, and they quickly endeavored to take over the western Dutch end of the island. Hearing of the small victory, the Massachusetts government decided to pledge 200 men and 2 warships toward the effort. The Plymouth colony, 100 men. All of this occurring in February of 1674. Meanwhile, at the same time, Governor Colve is managing Fort William Henrick. The nearby houses had been cleared away, and the fort was manned by an 800-man rotation. At any one time, 2/3 of those men were in the fort, and 1/3 allowed to return home. All of the surrounding towns had evacuation plans to seek shelter in New Orange if the English were to invade. It would seem that the New Englanders had finally found the courage to test Governor Colve and find out the true strength of the Dutch at New Orange. However, before the New Englanders could organize themselves effectively to launch an attack, a ship arrived from Scotland at the port of Boston. And now ships in those days, they carried correspondence and news, not just people and cargo. One little bit of news that the ship had was a copy of the Treaty of Westminster. And with that, the Massachusetts government knew that the Third Anglo-Dutch War was in fact over. Within a week, that news had trickled into New Netherland, and Governor Colve was aware that the war had ended. And with a copy of the treaty circulating around, he certainly knew the terms. Nevertheless, on May 12, 1674, Governor Colve makes an agreement of peace and mutual defense against the French with the Mohawk. Not a terribly innovative agreement. The Mohawk had long turned to the English before Governor Colve, and then to the Dutch before the English for similar agreements. A small footnote in history, but it revealed some of the inner workings of Governor Colve, who, despite knowing how the war ended and knowing the status of New Netherland, was not willing to yield anything to the English until some Dutch authority were to arrive and officially give him orders to hand over the colony. Yes, despite the treaty, this is still New Netherland. As such, Governor Colve tried to limit the number of people who learned about the Treaty of Westminster within the colony. Of course, this was very hard to do, and people found out anyway. But Colve himself would hold off reading publicly the Treaty of Westminster until July 1st, 1674. As you can imagine, with rumors swirling around and really no way to check them, after months of debating and gossip, once the governor finally gave the news, those in the colony who were ethnically Dutch resigned themselves to another rule by the English, just as they had the first time. The people of New Jersey had to face the fact that the Carteret government which was never popular, would probably be returning. And now Governor Colv's last duties as governor would be to, 1, make sure that the handover is peaceful and that the people who had aided the Dutch receive good treatment, if not complete amnesty for their actions during this second period of New Netherland. And the governor does just that. He keeps the colony together, and in late October of 1674, the new English governor arrived, Governor Edmund Andros. Colv negotiates the terms of surrender, outlines the rights and privileges that the citizens of New Netherland request be protected under the new English rule, but does not hand over the colony. Not yet, anyway. Colv spends about another week closing the very last chapter of New Netherland, and on October 31st of 1674, by the English calendar, which would be November 10th in the Dutch calendar of the time, Governor Colv surrenders the colony to Edmund Andros. And with that, New York is restored. Soon after this, the rights and privileges of the New Jersey colony will be reconfirmed by the Duke of York, and New Jersey will be restored. Colv absolved all of his magistrates of their oaths, and they collectively gifted him a small sum of money, and then Governor Colv even left Governor Andros his own personal carriage and 3 horses, which sounds pretty generous, but he wasn't going to take them on the boat, so... And that pretty much sums it up, which brings us to the legacy portion of this episode. What can we take away from this story, and how did this small episode influence colonial American history? Well, most importantly, to the course of this season of the podcast, the Lords Carteret and Berkeley, who had been the proprietary owners of the New Jersey colony, were eager to sell away all of their rights to that land, all of their responsibilities to govern that land. New Jersey had been a short-lived colony that was full of people who refused to pay taxes or acknowledge the authority of the proprietary government. A large part of that population then basically invited the Dutch to retake the area, and then the Dutch did. The recovery of the colony may only have put a smile on their faces, because now they would have the opportunity to finally sell it, which is exactly what they did. And this leads to the division of New Jersey into east and west portions. That's why it's part of this podcast. Yes, we will have an episode, or a collection of episodes, on East New Jersey and West New Jersey. Now, on the New York end of our New Netherland, the former New York Governor Lovelace, who seemingly handed himself over to the Dutch, once he made it back to England, he spent some time in the Tower of London, under suspicion that he wasn't just incompetent or a coward, but a turncoat, allowing the Dutch to take over the colony through purposeful inaction. But this meant that the new governor, Edmund Andros, would now take control of the fort of the restored New York City. And Edmund Andros will serve as our Darth Vader-like figure for the rest of this season. And for those of you who still don't care, it is because of Edmund Andros, the Glorious Revolution, and the events caused by and surrounding Andros, that we many years later ended up with 13 original colonies. But we're going to save all of that for a future episode. In the larger picture, it's worth noting that this little theater of the Third Anglo-Dutch War illustrates the restoration of the Prince of Orange to the former position of power that the title once carried. That Prince of Orange, whom everything in New Netherland seems to be named after, does indeed lose New Netherland. But in a few strange twists of fate, there will come the day that he remains the Prince of Orange, but will also be known as King William III of England. Now, usually I save the endnotes for my endnote episode, but because this story is so singular and based around just a few people, I admittedly only used a couple sources. And so I would like to mention first and foremost the book Dutch Raid on America by Donald Haslack and Robert Chamay, and a more recent paper written by Artyom Anakin in the Journal of New York History. You can find it in JSTOR, entitled The Last Soldier of Orange, which deals specifically with the life and times of Governor Colv, an under-researched subject of the time. And with that, our episode is over. Seemingly unimportant, fairly short, but not inconsequential. As we are now pivoting toward the end of the season, all my loose ends, I promise, will be tied up briefly. Find us on Facebook and Twitter and YouTube. Leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. I'm Eric Yanis. This has been the Other States of America History Podcast. Thank you for listening.